But every so often there is, kind of a source of irony in history, because the Roman Empire was completely reactionary, right? It was trying to hold back the wheels of history. But it was in ancient Rome, that the greatest class in all of history emerged. Because it was in Rome that you had the first proletarians, the first workers, right? So you had a lot of slaves in Rome, you had a lot of wealthy landowners, but a proletarian was different than a slave, right? The proletarian was a Roman citizen. They were not the property of somebody else, but they also did not own any property. The word proletarian actually comes from the Latin word meaning one who has children, because the only property that a proletarian had was their children, their offspring. The proletarians were people in Rome who sold their labor power in order to survive, right? They rented themselves out to a boss. And for the most part, proletarians were better off than slaves, but not always, right? For example, a slave is a piece of property that belongs to the master, right? So he's going to feed it, he's going to take care of it. But a proletarian, right? If a proletarian is not able to find work, they would starve on the street. And in Rome, they had huge problems with homelessness and homeless children, and it was a huge epidemic. And the population of proletarians in Rome continued to rise. The way Karl Marx described the proletariat, he described it as a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition and to all the fluctuations of the market. He's talking about the proletariat, right? The proletariat, the first proletarians existed in ancient Rome. The proletariat started to become the majority at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And today, the overwhelming majority of the human race are workers, are proletarians. And this book by the well-respected historian Michael Parenti, he actually talks about how the Roman historians, like Cicero and others, just had utter contempt for the proletariat. They hated the proletariat, right? The proletariat was they saw them as just a vile mass of people that they just had utter hatred for. One of the saddest things is that often you would see proletarians and slaves used against each other, right? So when Spartacus led his heroic slave revolt in the 1st century BC, who was used to crush it? It was the proletarians, right? The Romans said, hey, you may not own any property, but at least you're not a dirty, rotten slave, right? Go out and fight for the empire. Go out and fight for the republic. And they were used to crush the slave revolts. But there were other instances where it went the other way, when the proletarians were rioting, demanding food, or when the proletarians would go on strike. Often the slaves were then used to put down the revolts of the proletarians. So the proletarians and the slaves were constantly being played against each other and used against each other. Imagine what could have happened if the slaves and the proletarians had been able to work together, but that's not what happened. That's not how history went. Now, another thing that people often are confused about is, Rome was a republic. The Roman Empire was a republic for the first 5 centuries, right? For the first 5 centuries of its existence, Rome had elected leaders, it had a hereditary senate. And why was that? Why was Rome a republic? Because a republic is a much more efficient way of running an empire, right? If all of the power in Rome had been concentrated in the hands of one single king, people wouldn't have been as motivated to go out and wage wars and plunder other peoples. But if you have the Roman Forum, where people get up and express their view, if you have a Senate where they're taking votes and passing resolutions, if you have some elected figures, that gives people a feeling that they're part of the process, that they had some skin in the game, as they say, right? They themselves would gain something from it, right? By having a kind of consensus among the wealthy landowners in Rome, this prevented there from being constant civil wars between one ruling family and another. Every wealthy ruling family was represented to some degree or other, right? That was the idea. But this book by Dr. Michael Parenti, it's called, The Assassination of Julius Caesar and a People's History of Ancient Rome. And this book talks about how, even more than the proletarians, the people that the Roman leaders hated the most were what you could call populares. And those were politicians who rallied the proletarians and fought on their behalf against the rich and powerful. And the probably most famous and most important populare was Gaius Julius Caesar, a military leader. If you read about Julius Caesar, according to Michael Parenti, everything that we know about him is wrong. Most of what people know about Julius Caesar is based on a Shakespeare play. But everything we know about Julius Caesar, we've just got completely wrong. According to Parenti, he argues that Julius Caesar was fighting on behalf of the proletarians and the working class against the rich and powerful. And he goes over some of Julius Caesar's key reforms, right? For example, Julius Caesar cracked down on the lending of money, and he made it illegal for someone who lent somebody money to then confiscate their property if they couldn't pay it back. He also enacted luxury taxes, so that these rich Romans that were having their wild parties, they would have to pay taxes on any luxury imports they would bring in, and that would go into the public treasury. And what did they then do with the money? Well, Julius Caesar started a program of hiring the unemployed proletarians and sending them to places like Athens and different cities, Alexandria, and having them rebuild these cities in the hopes that these cities throughout the empire could become trading hubs and economically prosperous. So a lot of these construction proletarians were going out and doing that. And in addition to that, it's widely believed, many people allege that Julius Caesar burned the great library of Alexandria in Egypt. But Michael Parenti, he argues and documents in this book that that's not true. He says it's the opposite. He says Julius Caesar was so impressed with the great library at Alexandria, was so impressed with it that he actually created a network of libraries, public libraries in Rome. And you have to remember that was very important because that gave ordinary people, all Roman citizens, access to the public records and to written laws, right? So as the proletariat, the working class, was organizing itself, that gave them the ability to go and have access to information that they could use in political battles and legal struggles and such. The other important thing is that Julius Caesar actually freed a number of slaves. For example, at the time, one of the most valuable slaves you could have was a doctor, right? There were a lot of people who'd been trained in medical stuff in Greece or whatever, so if you were a wealthy Roman, you would buy a doctor, and he would be your doctor in case you got sick. Well, Julius Caesar freed all doctors, so that all doctors had Roman citizenship. He also granted Roman citizenship to all the teachers, and he was constantly freeing different slaves, bringing people into society. Another thing that Julius Caesar did was he actually legalized the Jewish religion and monotheism. There were a lot of proletarians in Rome who were Jews from Palestine. Skilled craftsmen had come to Rome, were working. And Julius Caesar, he changed the laws, because if you were a believer in monotheism, if you said there's only one God, that was illegal, because you were then denying the gods of the Roman Empire, right? Mars, Saturn, right? If you said there's only one God, like the Jewish religion says, then you were denying that. That was violation of their laws. Well, he changed that. He legalized Judaism. And it's interesting because, the Christian religion began as a religion among Jews in Rome. So think about how much differently history might have gone if Julius Caesar had not done that. If he had done all of the things I just mentioned, that wouldn't have been enough. But there were two particular reforms that he proposed. And those reforms are ultimately what caused the senators and the wealthy people to do him in. The first thing that Julius Caesar did was he talked about the fact that all the land in Rome, and land was the source of wealth, right? Land was the mines, land was the crops and the growing of food, that the land was concentrated in the hands of a few people. And he basically saw this was bad for the empire. So he began a program of land redistribution and distributing land to proletarians and poorer Romans, giving them a chance at land. The other thing that Julius Caesar did is he openly spoke about granting Roman citizenship to peoples throughout the empire. He argued that people in the Italian peninsula and people in Gaul and people in North Africa, that they ought to have some skin in the game also, right? They ought to be able to be citizens, so that they felt like they had something to gain from the Roman Empire. So he was talking about granting Roman citizenship throughout the Roman Empire. Well, Julius Caesar was killed. He was killed, and the people who killed him were probably the most powerful and wealthy people in Roman society. So people know about the Shakespeare play, a lot of which is Shakespeare's own mind that he made up, but there's a few things that are accurate. So we know that on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar woke up and he was planning to go visit the Senate. And his wife apparently had a dream that night that something bad was going to happen to him and urged him not to go to the Senate. And Julius Caesar said he had no interest in her womanish superstitions, and he went anyway, right? And he didn't take any bodyguards with him. And he actually famously said that to be constantly guarded is the worst thing, because it means that you're constantly afraid. And he went to the Senate, and then the richest people in Rome, the landowners, took turns stabbing him in the back and stabbing him over and over and over again. And he was killed. And that was the death of Julius Caesar. And in response to the death of Julius Caesar, the proletarians of Rome rose up and they burned the property of the rich and they rioted. The senators that killed Julius Caesar, they claimed they were defending democracy. It had to be done. Caesar was just too powerful. But the death of Julius Caesar really marks the end of the Roman Republic. For 5 centuries, they had had a Roman Republic, but that was the end of it, right? Afterwards, there was a civil war, and ultimately you got Octavian becoming Caesar Augustus, the emperor, and from then forward, you got an emperor. And that on 2 occasions, Julius Caesar had been offered to be the king or the emperor. He was in the Roman Forum on 2 different occasions, and these wealthy senators had had a crown. And they had walked toward him with this crown and tried to place the crown on his head. And both times, Julius Caesar had pushed the crown away. And then the crowd of workers and farmers and proletarians burst into applause and cheered for him. Because Julius Caesar didn't want to be king, right? 2 times he pushed the crown away. And that was really why Caesar was so dangerous to the rich and powerful Romans. He was far more powerful than anyone with a crown on their head ever could be, because his power came from the mobilization of people and the involvement of people in the political process, right? Now, I don't want folks to get me wrong here. I'm not saying that Julius Caesar was a socialist or a communist. He certainly wasn't that. Now, we do know that there were a few of these Stoic philosophers that actually kind of envisioned some kind of utopian society or something. Julius Caesar was not one of them, right? He freed a lot of slaves, but he also owned quite a few slaves. But Julius Caesar was a progressive. He understood that the Roman Empire's relationship with world history was leading it in a backward direction, would ultimately lead to its fall, and he was trying to change it. He was a progressive. And Julius Caesar was what you could call a Bonapartist, right? He was from the wealthy landowning classes of Rome. He was from the wealthy landowning classes. However, he made a strategic alliance with the proletariat in order to gain political power. You know, if you read the Shakespeare play, right, and Parenti is just, he's very, very hard on the Shakespeare play for just misrepresenting everything. But if you read the Shakespeare play, you have to remember Shakespeare's writing hundreds of years later. Shakespeare never went to Italy, never met Julius Caesar, had no idea what was going on. But the Shakespeare play is worth reading because Shakespeare is using the death of Julius Caesar, a historic event, in order to comment on the human condition. It's like King Lear or Macbeth. And what's interesting about it is he's basically commenting on the human relationship with power and authority. The way society is at this time, we need to have laws. We need to have a state. We need to have a government. But at the same time, we all hate the government. We all hate oppression. We hate authority. We all hate power, right? This is a contradictory aspect of the human experience. Or you can talk about a child, right? A child cannot survive without its parents. It depends on its parents. But at the same time, every child on some level hates its parents, right? The parents are authoritarian and making rules and controlling them, right? It's a contradictory aspect of the human experience. All the Roman leaders on some level realized that Rome needed a leader like Julius Caesar, right? They needed somebody who would come in there and change things around to make it sustainable. However, in order to do that, they would have to give up their own profits in the short term. And what I think is interesting is that Marxism, the theory of Marxism has this understanding, that you can put forward a vision, this ideal goal of a world that is so full of material abundance and so full of products and so full of advanced technology that the need for any kind of state can just kind of fade away, right? That coercion and repression can go away, right? That we can advance civilization to the point that people can just kind of do what they feel like doing and take what they want or take what they need, right? From each according to his own ability to each according to his needs, right? That's the Marxist goal of the higher stage of communism, a society with so much material abundance that people can be free and that there's no need for a state and no need for coercion. But Marxists argued that in order for us to get toward that higher stage of communism, the proletariat, the working class, has to rise up and seize control of the economy, of the major centers of economic power, the banks, factories, and industries, and seize control of them and operate the economy rationally, not according to the chaos of the market, and that's how this ultimate goal can be reached. Now,